family. Happy Wednesday. It is good to be able to be with you today. Nathaniel and Brenna are actually away celebrating his graduation with some family down in North Carolina. And so I get the opportunity to be with you twice this week. And we're celebrating with them as they are away. But today, speaking of vacation, we're going to trace a theme around that idea of vacation or around rest. And as we do, I just want to throw some statistics at you here. A number of years ago, CNBC did a survey of Americans, and just let some of these sink in. 25% of Americans do not take all of the vacation days that are allotted to them. 15% of Americans do not take any of the vacation days allotted to them. And 50% of Americans still work while they are on vacation. Pretty staggering statistics when you think about it. And we're not going to talk about vacation per se. We're going to talk about Sabbath. We're going to talk about rest. Nathaniel on Wednesday has been exploring this theme of a rule of life, and we're going to see how the idea of Sabbath or rest fits into that. Now, in this time with COVID, some of you maybe are able to rest more than you have been able to in a long time, and that's great. Other people wish that they actually were back at work in this season. And that's understandable too, because we were made to work, but we were also made for a rhythm of rest. And if you're like me, sometimes you may actually be embarrassed to rest. I know this sneaks itself up in my life sometimes if I'm taking a nap, and it's rare that I get the opportunity to do it. Maybe I should more frequently than I do. But when I am taking a nap, and if somebody calls and I actually dare answer my phone, if somebody says, "Hey, did I wake you up?" it's almost like I'm ashamed to admit it. It's almost like, no, I'm not one of those people that take naps, right? No, take a nap, rest. We need to get our minds around that because, again, God made us with a need for a rhythm of rest. And Sabbath, I want us to start thinking about Sabbath as a weapon of sorts. It's a weapon that strikes a blow at our self-sufficiency. Once a week, we need to enter into a time of rest so that we recognize that our work isn't as essential as God's is. Just plain and simple. The Sabbath is a weekly reminder, so to speak, of the fact that we're not sovereign, but that God is. And we enter into a rest that He has prepared for us. And we're going to see a little bit more of that in just a second. But isn't it also strange that God puts these rhythms, a weekly rhythm by the Sabbath, into the scriptures and into our lives? We've built our calendar even on it, even though we don't follow it as much as we should. And hopefully that'll change even the other side of this video. But also in the Bible, when creation is described in Genesis chapter 1, have you ever noticed that the day begins with night? It says, and there was evening and morning the first day. Day begins with evening. Now, we think that the day begins when we wake up in the morning and we start because, again, we think the world revolves around me and my work, and I'm just so important that I need to be about these tasks. Well, in fact, it's as if God, even in the very beginning, the very first chapter of the Bible, He reminds us that life is really about Him, that the world does not spin off of its axis if we're not able to do our work. God's in charge. And so the Sabbath is like a weapon that strikes a blow at our self-sufficiency. And there are lots of different passages of Scripture that we could look at to explore this theme of Sabbath. You could look at Exodus 20 or Exodus 31. I'd encourage you to do that at some point. But isn't it interesting that we take a positive command, even from the Ten Commandments, honor the Sabbath day. It's written at first in positive language, honor the Sabbath day, which makes it stand out from all the other ones that are like thou shalt nots. But we take a positive command and we turn it into a negative thing. We focus on all of the limits when God is focused on the positive part of it. We have a real problem with our perspective of the Sabbath, and that's what we want to talk about. Why is it that we struggle with Sabbath keeping? Why is it that our perception is oriented around limits and negatives rather than the positives? And just one more quick comment about the original Sabbath command. Notice that it says you will keep, or we are to keep the Sabbath holy, not make it holy. We cannot add to or subtract from the holiness of the Sabbath by what we do or do not do on the Sabbath. We enter into the holiness of it. It already is. God has declared it as such. And so our keeping of the Sabbath, our honoring of the Sabbath, is an entering into the rest God's provided for us. That leads me to the text in Mark chapter 2. It's one of my favorite texts in the New Testament on Sabbath keeping. And I just want to point out two things here. We don't have time to dive into all of it, but here's the text. Jesus is walking through the grain fields on the Sabbath with his disciples. And the text says, as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? They're focused on the negatives of the Sabbath. Again, that's our problem, right? We're oftentimes focused on the negatives of the Sabbath rather than on the positives. And Jesus then tells this weird story, and we're not going to have time to unpack this today. But he says to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God? And at the time of Abiathar the priest, he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, this is the key verse, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Again, just a couple things to point out here. First, the Pharisees' response is so focused on the negatives of the Sabbath. They had 600 ways that they applied the nots to the Sabbath. They said there were 600 different ways that you could break the Sabbath, and so you should avoid these things. They were so focused on the negative side of the Sabbath that they didn't enter into the joy. That is what Jesus is really after here. Jesus is aimed at the joy of the Sabbath. Another way of putting this, when you think about what the Pharisees were doing, is that it's as if rather than the Pharisees honoring the Sabbath, or better, honoring the Lord who gave them the Sabbath, which is, I think, Jesus' point in verse 28. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. This is a good gift that I've given you. Honor God in the Sabbath. Rather than honoring the Lord of the Sabbath, rather than honoring the Sabbath, they were trying to honor themselves by what they did or didn't do on the Sabbath. And so they missed it. They didn't enter into the Sabbath rest. But Jesus is focused all on the joy. He says in verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus' point again there is you can't make the Sabbath more or less holy. It just is holy. It is because God has made it such. God has made it a day of rest. Enter into it. Enter into that. And what would it look like for you to keep a Sabbath? There are 4 things that I just want to very practically mention. If you're going to enter into the rest of the Sabbath, and if you're going to begin practicing this as part of your rule of life, a weekly rhythm of recognizing the sovereignty of God, striking a blow against your self-sufficiency, what can you do? First, stop. Very simply, let's just stop. Stop working. That's one way that you could actually translate Sabbath. It just literally means knock it off. Stop it. Cease. Refrain from working. I know it's so hard for us. We Americans love to work, but we need to love to rest. It's a good gift that God has given. The Sabbath was given for man. It was given for you. God knows what we need. And as a good Lord, Lord of the Sabbath, he has given it to us as a gift. So first, stop. And I think it's a command, church, to stop for a reason, because God knows we're going to struggle with this. So he doesn't give us a way out. He just gives us a command. He says, knock it off. Stop. Cease. Secondly, refresh. Exodus 31 describes God as being refreshed on the Sabbath. Strange, right? I mean, how can God, who doesn't know any weakness, he's not diminished through his work, how can God say to be refreshed? I don't know. It's a conundrum. But if God needs to be refreshed in some way, shape, or form, and I think it's a personification in one sense, we need to recognize the fact that we need to be refreshed. So whatever you do, and I'm not going to be prescriptive on what you can or cannot do, because I think that's pharisaical, but I will be descriptive of the Sabbath. Whatever you do, it better be refreshing. if it's not recreative, if it doesn't spark your recreative sense, if you don't feel refreshed afterwards, you're probably not keeping it the way that you should. So think about that. Stop, refresh. Third, worship. That one ought to be very clear. But Jesus says here in Mark 2 that we need to honor, or that we need to recognize the Lord of the Sabbath. That's the idea of him taking his rightful throne, and we do that through worship. It's one of the reasons why we want to gather together again. We honor God when we gather together and we worship. That's a way that we honor or set apart the Sabbath day. We worship together. So stop it. Don't work on the Sabbath. Refresh. Be recreated on the Sabbath. Third, definitely worship. Do not forsake gathering together as some are in the habit of doing, but all the more, as the writer of Hebrews says, as we see the day approaching. And then finally, enjoy. Enjoy the Sabbath. It ought to be a delight. That, I think, is something that Jesus was always trying to challenge the Pharisees on as well. Ken Shigematsu, and we'll end with this, in his book, God in My Everything, it's a book where he basically explores this idea of establishing a rule of life. In his chapter on the Sabbath, listen to what he writes. He says, our Sabbath rule should set us free to enjoy God and to glorify him in all that we do. It's a day to eat different foods, to take a nap, to spend time with people that you love, to make love, to enjoy nature, to enjoy sport, to enjoy music, to worship, and to celebrate God and his good gift of life with others. Sabbath is about shucking the have-tos and allowing God to recreate you. So here's my question. Are you entering into the joy of the Sabbath? What would it look like for you to start practicing that as a rule of life? Is there something you need to stop? Is there a way that God is inviting you to be refreshed? Are you worshiping him? Are you enjoying God and his creation on the Sabbath day? I'm praying for you guys. Continue to do that. We and the elders together are doing that. If you need something, reach out to us. We'd be glad to help in any way possible. But let's enter into this rest that God provides for us by practicing the Sabbath. Blessings, church. We love you guys.